What is the life of the involvement of the architect, and at what point do you let life, in some sense, contaminate what the project in your imagination might have been earlier?
SPNA as a studio has varied types of projects under their belt, but they do have a significant focus on religious, residential, and cultural architecture. Their studio is structured to actively engage with research, collaborations, and collective models of practice, and not as a conventional individual formats, but as interdependent streams. We have with us today architects Sameer Fedora and Sakshi Gulati.
It's basically a practice that, in hindsight, comes out of a series of positions that we take on projects. One is, of course, the typical model of practice where there is a client who comes to us with a project, and it's a project that we actually are happy to do, for which we get paid. There are projects that we are actually working on where we are collaborating with other people on projects, whether it is other architects, whether it is also people who are craftsmen who know a lot more about a certain way of doing things that we might not be familiar with. And there is also the collective, the Banner Collective that I've already mentioned. That's another format of practice that we engage with to look at how we can contribute to space making in the city, at the scale of the city. And finally, this idea of research, and given that there are lots of students on this kind of call, it's important to kind of also register that research and practice need not be two kind of different approaches to life in general, or to architecture in general, but it's something that is inherently interwoven, if you want it to be like that. And hopefully by the end of this kind of project, or this kind of presentation, you'll have a sense of how that works. Next. Yeah, just a quick recap. This is, of course, projects that we've done, beyond the urban. This is Jetwan, where we've actually done these kind of inverted roof profiles that allow you to actually sit inside the space and then still connect with the foliage of the trees around. We collaborated with Hunarshala on this, building with stone dust, waste stone dust, and creating this entire project out of a material ecology that is partially off the place, but is also partially kind of invented as we've looked for various bottlenecks to kind of overcome various bottlenecks that we've had. Go next. Yeah, just flick through it, Sakshi. That's these are drawings, and that just talk about that idea of the material ecology, and you've probably already seen some of this online, and there's enough data on this. But just so that you know, the original intent of this project was to actually build with the rammed earth. But when we found that the earth needed a lot of cement to stabilize, we actually started looking for alternatives. And Hunarshala really helped us here, where we actually worked with them to do these walls that were made out of local basalt stone dust that was available in a quarry close by. Next. I mean, there are various facets of the project, which I won't go into too much detail, but if there are questions, we are most happy to kind of answer them. Next. So these are just some images of the project, the kind of tactility that the walls seem to have. In fact, we had a couple of trainees who'd been to Jetwan over the weekend, and they were talking about how people had made changes on some of the things that we had done. And it just kind of also brings up the question as to what is the life of the project. What is the life of the involvement of the architect, and at what point do you let life, in some sense, contaminate what the project in your imagination might have been earlier? Next. Yeah, this is, of course, the Maya Somaya library project. It's again been fairly well published. Here it talks not just about a material ecology and a material basis for the project, but also talks about the way that we actually sit today on knowledge systems, on networks and knowledge systems that are networked throughout the world, and how we are building this project in rural Maharashtra with material that's available to us here, but we are at the same time using a construction technique from 16th century Spain, steel details from 1960s Uruguay, the work Velázquez Dieste, and also the RhinoVolt, which is a software that's made in Switzerland, form finding software that allows us to build pure compression structures. So that is, yeah, go next. You obviously know this project, so I'm not going to talk too much more about this unless there are specific questions. Go next. Yeah. This is actually a project that we've done in on the outskirts of Mumbai. It's a small factory building, common office space, and it's a corner plot. What we try to do is actually open up the heart of the building to that corner. So when you see the building from a distance, you're able to look right through into the heart of the building. Go next. That's how what we actually also found on site was this water body that was formed during a seasonal water body that was full during the monsoons and then would also act as an overflow for that area around because it was low lying. And what we tried to do was retain that in the architecture of the building and look at how we could just create this kind of bridge that allowed you to walk into the factory over that sunken kund. Next. That's a section to show how that overflow actually works and how that kund becomes a part of the architecture of the building, but also the ecology of the area. Next. These are just some images of the project. Go next. That's the kund that I was talking to you about. Next. The other part of our process also involves, like I said, research, and this is really our exhibit at the Seoul Biennale in 2019, just before COVID hit. So I got lucky and did one trip to Seoul before this, before we were grounded for 2 years. But it really talks about the idea of the collective city and our approach, or the approach that architectural practitioners can have or do have to the city. So while we were invited to, of course, present our own work in the Biennale, we were also asked to kind of co-curate a small India section within it. Go next. This India section involved the work of our colleagues, our peers, people like PK Das, the Bus Ride, Urban Design Studio, the Street Art India Foundation. So lots of people were a part of this group that we curated with little panels on each of their practices. But what was interesting is to also start looking at the alternatives that architectural practice now seems to present within our country. And this is maybe not just about architecture as a form of building an actual project, but also as a means, for instance, of social resistance to projects that might not be as let's say, convincing for the future of a city or for an environment. Or the idea of how architecture or architects can become part of creating infrastructure for celebratory events like Abin does in Calcutta with his the pandals that he does for Durga Puja every year, or the work of Architecture Red in Chennai and Bandra Collective here in Mumbai, where we are looking to work with local resident groups to see what is the kind of interventions that we can actually make within the city fabric. Or just even the idea of documentation and how this idea of collective memory is really a resource that can also be projective and does not need to be primarily only backward looking, which is seen through the work of Rohan Mukul and, of course, Riyaz Tayyabji, a good friend of mine from Ahmedabad. So yeah, I'm just kind of paraphrasing what was the kind of intensive, let's say, body of work that these 4 categories seem to encompass. But the idea here is that there are already models of practice that exist that look beyond the traditional mode of practicing architecture. Next. These are just some of those exhibits that we had at Seoul. Next. This is the research bit of our practice, which involves the work that we are doing through SPARE. This is our last book, which was on housing types in the city of Mumbai. I mean, you might already know it as In the Name of Housing, which is also an exhibition. It's also now published by the Dutch publishers NAI, and it's called How to Build an Indian House. There is our second publication that will hopefully be available by the end of by the middle of next year, or early part of next year, which is going to be on coding, how building code creates certain urban fabric in Mumbai, and how you can actually start looking at building code not just as a series of words in a book, but really as a means to also prescribe a kind of spatial environment that you experience every day. Go next. So these are just drawings from that. This really talks about how light and ventilation become, either, let's say, affected, not just in a good way, but also badly. In the case of Mahol, the housing that was in the news, where it was found that every fifth member living in this complex had some kind of respiratory diseases, and this was primarily due to the lack of light and ventilation in the rooms itself. Next. Just some more drawings talking about how podiums were kind of evolved into this archetype that almost starts structuring half of your city. And all these new buildings that you see built of a certain scale now look at the podium as a means to structure the project, but also creates a kind of disconnect with the existing fabric around where the building's positioned. Next. Well, Bandra Collective, of course, is a group of 6 architects. You guys already know this group, I'm assuming. There is Architecture Brio, there's the bus ride, there's Proneet, there is Samir De Monte and Alan Abraham architects. So this is the work that we've done on Carter Road. Next. Where we've kind of done this entire promenade. We also, during the lockdown, were starting to look at how we could work with distancing measures when the lockdown opened. Parts of this next were actually implemented in Grant Road and as distancing circles, which is an interesting exercise. Next. So that's, I think, what the part that I've just finished talking about has really just been to give you an overview of the kinds of models of practice we actually operate through, and the way and the kind of work, the body of work that each of those models create. But what I'm now showing you is a couple of projects that have been fairly recent. This is Temple of Steps. Some of you might know this already, and there's a particular reason why I'm showing the project, though it's been published fairly extensively. But it's really this idea of how a temple section actually works with the horizontal, as does the idea of water and the kund, and how the kund and the temple were always in some sense linked traditionally. And that impression in some sense creates the architecture of this particular project. Go next. Yeah, these are just some images of the model. Next. Again, if you're kind of looking at it, what you're really seeing is a set of curated pictures of what the project was at the key moments where it evolved into what it finally became. While I'm doing this, Sakshi will actually end up showing you a lot more detail about how the processes are by which we actually kind of develop these projects. She might not talk about it a lot, but what you'll actually end up seeing is just a kind of vast set of, just massive data on how we actually process any of these projects. Go next. So this is just, and this is another thing that we are really very keen on, is to kind of look at this idea of drawing and how drawing becomes integral to the way that we imagine the project, and how it also kind of captures the references that we are constantly working with when we are actually thinking through a new project. Go next. I won't again get into the plan, but it's basically three kinds of build forms. One is the Varahaswamy, which is the entry shrine, then the main Balaji temple, and of course the priest quarters and a community kitchen that happens in the project. Go next. That's a kind of schematic that shows you the relationship between various parts of the temple. So also it's based extensively on the Balaji temple from the 10th century. So it uses a lot of the planning principles from that period, and then kind of develops an architecture that is specific to its kind of performance of not just a temple, but any kind of building in that context. I'll explain that as we go ahead. Next. So the temple actually had a low-lying area around, which we converted into a kund of sorts. The Varahaswamy shrine actually has a little kund where they actually wash the deity, but we developed that as almost this kind of moat-like quality that surrounds the temple. The idea was to create this harvesting body, water harvesting body that will also allow groundwater recharge. Because of the fact that this is a dry area, a lot of the planting in this area also has changed over time. They now grow a lot of chilies and cotton, but it's really something that requires extensive. I mean, because they don't really have as much availability of water. So what we were trying to do is trying to use wastewater that came out from quarrying that was being done for limestone to produce cement. There was water being produced as a byproduct, and we were using the same water to kind of bring back into this water harvesting pond to remediate it through plants, and then to also let it recharge groundwater. And if there was excess, to let that run back into the fields for farmers to use. Go next. Yeah, that just gives you a sense of how that entire system operates, and you can see the cement plant in the background. Go next. So the water infrastructure really was not a part of the project brief. It's something that we add, we kind of bring into the project, so that the project is not just a kind of accommodation of a certain program that we receive as a part of the brief, but it has layers that we add to enrich the brief that does not just have value from let's say a kind of socio-cultural point of view, but also real value, which improves maybe the lives of the people who live around the space through this increasing of the groundwater or the runoff being used in the fields, as you can see here in the image. Go next. Yeah, next. 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 So it's you can see the idea of the kund and the and the temple kind of fuse together here. Next. Yeah, I think we put too many images of this of the temple in this, but yeah, it's just the inside. So the entire thing is being built out of corbelled stone. So it's not stone cladding. It's actually solid stone, local limestone that we use to build this temple with. But I know in the introduction it was said that we have a focus on doing religious building, but unfortunately, or fortunately, we've only done 2. So it just sounds like a lot. I mean, in the sense that it feels like a lot, but we've just done 2 buildings. But yeah, both of them have been very interesting, very special in many ways. The first one, which is the original Shiv temple, was built through Shramdan. So that was a completely different way of looking at the act of building. And the second was the temple steps, which was in some sense, really a kind of effort to see how the typology of the temple can exist beyond its mere program. Go next. However, when you actually work on religious building, you're also kind of walking a fine line, because you're looking to challenge not only notions of what traditional architecture are, but also in the way that people perceive it. And we actually got after that, I mean, though the temple actually received a lot of good press, but it also, I'm fairly reticent on social media, but we were getting comments on how we were getting comments from people on the left who were talking about how we were temple builders and we were building a Hindu Rashtra, while all the other guys who were from the right, obviously from the right wing, talking about how this is not real temple architecture and this is not Hindu architecture, and how we were actually kind of contaminating that. So we got shuttered from both sides. But what that actually kind of shows also is the fact, I mean, that you're probably doing the right thing. If you just piss off almost everyone involved in the project, you're kind of you're probably looking at something that might point towards a new direction of looking at how to do a particular thing. Next. All right. So this is a little cafeteria that we've done. It's a little addition to our engineering college where we're trying to build almost this pavilion-like space. It's in Mumbai. It's in Sion. It's an attachment to our existing building that we had designed. It's sandwiched between the existing building that we had designed and an old engineering college building, which is down to 7 stories. Go next. Next. Yeah, next. So it's just a very simple kind of roof, but it's really this is the architecture of the project. It's just this a column that holds both the seat, holds the roof, and it creates this seamless plinth that is modulated only by the trees that you're actually cutting around. So next. So this is just that exact same position. Next. Next. Yeah, you can see how the entire project gets punctuated or gets cut up wherever there are trees, and it kind of almost weaves its way through the entire trees that are actually sitting in. But it's just still a simple floating plane that sits below the foliage of the trees. Sometimes also picking up on the shade that you actually get from the tree. You can see you'll probably see it in another image. Go next. Yeah, next. 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 I think this is one of the last few projects that I'll show before Sakshi takes over. This is a building that we finished actually in 2017 or 2018, if I'm not wrong. And it's a project that we worked on for about 5 years before that as well. It's a residential building in Hyderabad. It's a building where the client came to us in the beginning saying that they had already gotten a plan approved, because Hyderabad actually works on form-based coding, where the entire envelope extents is kind of decided, and then you're only operating in the area that is defined as a footprint. So there wasn't much that we could change with the building footprint. But what we try to do next is to see if we could actually create houses with cross ventilation. So we structured the plan in a way that you'd always get at least 3 sides that were open, that would allow air to kind of flow through the house. So so there was one. Next was to actually start looking at what we could do with the building facade, where the thickness of the building facade was then kind of defined by the way that you would articulate the openings and the shade that you require for the openings. Also, it creates a very interesting condition as to how do you then structure a window within that. Go next. So this is a little GIF, or it's a video, sorry, you'll have to play that, Sakshi. So what you see here is the logic of the skin, where the chhaja that you need, the stone chhaja that we actually put in, is supported by the corbelled brick that you see on the side. So that's one thing I think generally as a kind of trajectory from when I kind of started practice to where we are at today, is to move in some sense away from the idea of the compositional, because or at least the prescribed compositional, where the nature or the project itself is defined by the intent of the architect. It is by the intent, what I actually mean is by the compositional intent, about what looks good, what doesn't. I think what our effort now over all these years is to move away from that to a certain extent, to see how the inherent logic of a project and its assemblage of program, of material, of the way that things come together, and the performance of this should really dictate the nature of the manifestation of the actual building finally. So this is, I think, in one of those examples where what the building skin does is very closely tied to what it performs as a kind of shading, and the corbel takes the load off that stone lintel to shade. And what you actually see, and you probably see it in the next better in the next image next, is the format that we kind of employ, where we start looking at the corbel type. How do you actually modularize it, and how do you still create variation within that? So these are just drawings that we use to document that. Next. But at a basic level, it's the idea of the corbel, it's the idea of the corbel taking the load of the chhaja, and it's the idea of the bay window that floats within that opening. So that's really what this exploded axonometric shows. Go next. And that's what that detail turns out to be. And really whatever the point that I was trying to make earlier was just this, that you try and look at materials and look at it through the lens of performance. You try to look at form, and you look at form through the lens of performance, because the idea of trying to build something in a particular formal assemblage should not be contingent on the whim of the architect. It must be what the project needs, because we are at a point in the way that we actually build, in the way that we consume resources, that efficiency now is of paramount value. You should be able to do more with using less material or using less resource, given the way that the resources on our planet are fast depleting. So I think that as an approach is contingent now to every project that we try and do. Go next. Yeah, that's the building. Next. Yeah, these are just some more images. Next. So what's important is this, that while we were working with these master masons who were coming out of Pondicherry, what we were also trying to do is not just create a certain building, a certain form in a building. Of course, like I've already talked about the fact that it had to perform in a particular way, but it's also to figure out how you can actually create a mechanism for even craft to evolve. So in this case, these are simple jigs that we've actually done to allow for the mason to corbel the next brick that sits above it. So the lower template aligns with the lower brick, the upper template aligns with the upper brick, and that allows you to create a consistent set of corbels that actually turn into the building finally. So in this case, what we were really successful with, I think, is the idea that we were able to design tools, low tech maybe, but tools that would allow you to build something that was a lot more specific to what we were trying to achieve. Go next. Yeah, so this is some images of it under construction, using those tools that I showed you. Kota House, go next, Sakshi. I think, is it still there? Kota, did I not remove it? Okay, my bad. But this is a
Still there,
yeah. Okay. So this is a project that we've almost finished now. It's in Kota, and it's basically a series of hostel rooms. As you might know, Kota is almost the first stop to IIT, supposedly. Everyone who wants to join IIT goes to Kota to study. They have some insane success rate, and which is why it's an amazingly let's say it's a dynamic space in the sense that every year you have 1 lakh new students who move in to try and crack the exam, the entrance exam, and who stay on. So there is, if you see the rooms, they're almost like warehouses where they're kind of bringing in these products who will turn into IIT engineers. So what we were trying to do within this is trying to see if we could use the idea of the hostel to create housing that was much more sensitive to the students and the time that they spent to create much more open space where they could interact with each other, and also in some sense de-stress from the rigor that they have to actually put into to generate the results that they seek to make. And this is just a kind of a flattened perspective drawing of that plan and the elevation of it. Go next. These are just images of it under construction. You'll see some of this, the logic of that plan, and how next it kind of ties into this idea of the courtyard and the Haveli, and how these multiple terraced courtyards also create shaded spaces for people to kind of inhabit. Go next. So that's the plan at the ground level. Go next. That's one of the upper floors. And as you keep going up, you also get a number of terraces. And finally, you get to the owner's residence right at the top. Yeah, next. That section, it also shows you how you're trying to also cross-ventilate these rooms. So Kota, as you know, is in Rajasthan, gets really hot. And cross-ventilation obviously is something that we were trying to work with. We're also trying to work with the idea of the jali and how that naturally creates a kind of cooling effect within the rooms. Of course, the rooms have air conditioning, but we're hoping that they're on days that are not so hot, students will try and keep the windows open. Go next. Yeah, these are just some images of it under construction, the idea of the balcony, the idea of the Jarokha, the idea of the Jali. Next. That's the assemblage underway. Go next. Sakshi, you can skip through this project, it's fine. I think, yeah, this is a rapid reuse project in Himachal Pradesh. We are converting an old fort into a resort. And now, okay, this is another project that we are building in Goa. It's housing. It's housing. It looks at combining the type of the bungalow with the type of the apartment to see if we can actually create a hybrid where apartments also have courtyards. And because of the fact that it's on a steep hillside, you're able to create these terraces as you kind of go up the hill. Go next. Yeah, it's bang next to it's just behind Charles Correa's villas. So you're building next to, let's say, a master and someone's work who you've kind of greatly admired. I've been to these houses, and they're absolutely incredible in the way that they negotiate space and levels. So you're a little nervous about building in that precinct, but yeah, we tried. We tried doing something that we thought referenced both this kind of nuance of the way that Correa worked on levels with, and respond to our site, which was a little different from where Correa built. Next. Next section. Yeah, these are just images, drawings of those of the block. That's the kind of miniature of showing that those layered courtyard terraces. It's an incredible plan that Vami kind of figured out, which was basically, I mean, it's really how the plan works. That's the key to the project, and it's really Vami, who's kind of a genius at working with these kind of plan types. She was able to kind of figure out how to get this entire thing to work. Go next. Next. Yeah, that's the project. So it's a series of these courtyards that kind of around which these apartments are structured. Go next. These are model pictures. We work extensively on physical models. I mean, Sakshi is going to elaborate that, so I won't get into that process. But go next. Yeah, Sakshi, will you take over from here?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Zama.
Sakshi, the entire. I saw a couple of people from the studio sign in, so I'm just.
Really, I knew it. Oh yeah, I can see them, but that's okay. I can work with them later. But okay. So Zama was the first project that I did here. It's a 1 acre site, and we have 14 villas here on this one site. So the biggest challenge that we had here was one, that the site was a catchment area. So during monsoons, the entire site would fill up. And also, as per the brief, there were a lot of villas. So 14 villas on a 1 acre site is a lot of built area. So another challenge was to, make sure that it doesn't look as built out as, you look at the plan and think that it is. So the first thing that we did was study the site contour levels. Like I said, that during monsoon, the entire site would flood up. So what we did was we inverted the site levels and created this island with these units that have been plugged onto the island, and they almost look like they're floating, during monsoons. Then what we did was, because 14 villas was a lot, and when we really started placing them on site, like Sameer said, we work extensively with physical models. When we started putting it on site, it felt like the central area was not open enough. So what we started doing was, started tilting back and started creating these pockets, where you can actually look up and look at the sky. So you see more of the sky, and it almost feels a little more open than it would if it wasn't stepping back. Then looking at the organization, same thing that we mentioned before, putting it in a straight line would mean that we only experience the front facade of the villa. And then we actually started staggering them so that every turn you experience a new part of the site, and every turn is a different experience. And this is how we generated the unit. What we started with was a very clear idea of the organization. So we divided the entire flow plate, and the entire massing in some sense into two very clear bays. One was a service bay and one was a residential bay. So after that, we also then started scooping out central parts of the massing, so that every room has cross ventilation. So if you actually look at the section, you'll notice that every room really gets cross ventilation at all times. Another thing that we started doing was to categorize functions in a way that you have, because it's a gated community, you also want to engage with people, and at times you also want your own privacy. So the lower level was entirely public programs, and the upper level, which was more private, were the residential programs. Again, when you look at the section, you'll see how the formal living dining opens into the central street, which is a more public function. And then you have this one courtyard, which separates the more private family room, which opens into a private backyard and a private pool. So this was the unit. And here is the physical model.
Sorry, I'm just going to make one kind of addition here. I think what was for us, interesting. Go back to the model, Sakshi, the models. Yeah. What was interesting for us to explore in this project was to see how we could keep that low-lying nature of the site and turn it into, in some sense, an advantage for us to structure the project. So what you see, along the edges is where we are hoping, if there is a kind of flooding due to a monsoon, that it'll actually happen along the edge, and that's also where we structured our pool. But what this also kind of points to, in some way, is the idea that we are living in a world where resilience is going to be a very, very important thing to kind of consider. And I think the more our projects start imagining these bottlenecks or these conditions, these extreme conditions that we have to grapple with, only then will we be able to look at solutions that address them. What Sakshi also mentioned was the idea of a gated community. How do you end up subverting that? How can you subvert it when you're actually working with typical developers, understanding of what these communities are? So in our case, what we tried to do was create this entire street, which is in some sense a public street, where people from their living rooms can actually kind of access that directly. So it creates a sense of community. So I can have, let's say, my children play out in the garden and mingle with somebody else's children who are playing in the, on that street from another house. So the street really then becomes a means for us to structure this project. So it's no longer, while it does have a boundary and it's kind of cut off from its surrounding road and other plot developments around, but it still creates an environment within which alludes to this idea of a social coherence between the residents. Sorry, Sakshi, go ahead.
Some more images of the model where you can see how the street opens up because of the kind of form that we have. Here are a couple of site pictures. So the project is, I think in 2 months is going to be completely done, and we're going to hand over. The walls are clad with local basalt. We got slabs which we cut on site, and we wanted Mangalore tile roofs, but of course when it went to site, because of the slope, a lot of vendors were not very confident about executing it on site because they were worried that during monsoon they might not hold up. Which is when we shifted to these metal shingles. And this is another picture of the central street.
What that's also giving you, go back, Sakshi, sorry, just by one.
Yeah.
What it's also giving you in that image is that sense of scale and the kind of self-shading that you'll get on the street. So while the views are still opening out, in the way that the sky becomes a part of your experience here, you're still walking within shaded, shaded streets, so to speak. So, and each of these programs opens up into that, creating a space that can be used by people because it's not directly, kind of open to the sun. Next. Sorry, go ahead, Sakshi. Yeah, you were saying something.
Another image of the site where the upstand was unfinished. Then another image of the site where you can see the street. You can see how all the programs open into the street. Anything that you want to add for Zama, Sameer?
No, I'm good. We've what Sakshi will show you now are two big projects. And one is a house, and the second is a kind of housing project, industrial housing project. Both are projects that are currently at the tendering stage, where people are being kind of invited to bid for the project. But what I think she will show you here is just a set of iterations that we've actually worked on to get to a final project. As well as the kind of intensive work that you do after the design process is completed. So it's not just design in some sense will play that minuscule role compared to the other factors that go into a project becoming what it does. So Sakshi, yeah, just go ahead. I mean, I'll kind of.
Okay. Dalmia House again is a 1 acre site. So, to put things into perspective, the project before this was a 1 acre site where we had 14 villas, and Dalmia House is a similar size site, 1 acre site with 4 villas. So what we first start as soon as we get a project is to start with massing, and we work extensively with physical models. So what we started doing was started putting everything on the site to understand how much we're really building, to understand scale, and to really understand how to approach a project, once we really start categorizing it, using these massive models. So when we really started working with these models, we then were able to categorize the plan types into 4 very distinct categories. One being the street with pavilions, second being a larger courtyard with program around it, and the fourth being 4 villas with individual smaller courtyards and still connected with each other. So that's what leads us to, yeah. So like I said, the first one was a street and pavilion, where we had all our common programs stacked in the middle, forming the street, and all our private programs are plugged onto the street, almost like these pavilions. Then we had this small courtyard where we split all the 4 villas into smaller components, with each courtyard of its own, with one large courtyard connecting all of them. Then we had one big courtyard with programs stacked around it. The common programs almost tilted to go into the central area, and all the other private programs were on the periphery. So another part of the brief really was that the client wanted the structure to be a part of nature. So he didn't want the structure to really stand out, and he also wanted us to blend it with the surroundings in some way, so that it's almost like these cottages in the woods. So we tried a couple of approaches. One is this street and pavilion, like I mentioned, where all our private programs are stacked in the middle, where
all your common programs are in the middle: the living room, dining room, family room, all that in the middle. And all your other programs like the bedrooms happen towards the edges.
Yeah, and between each block, we have these dense plantations. So when you're actually looking at it from outside, it really looks like these floating pavilions. Another thing that we did was tilted it along the wind direction. So we had a very extensive wind study, and the water bodies are placed accordingly, so that naturally during summers you have your summer winds blowing over these water bodies, thereby cooling these the central programs. And also every room then had cross ventilation. This is one of the physical model that we generated for the same. Another approach, a very different approach from the previous one. So the same plan type applied to this, but what we did was we lifted our landscape over the structure. So it almost looked like the landscape continued to, build the structure, and eventually you would really not see a building. All you see is your land continuing up into these mounds. Then we had the small courtyard option, where each public program, which was the common program, opened into these courtyards, which was then connected with each other. And then you had these private programs, which were your bedrooms on the periphery. Again, some massing studies that we did through the models. In this option again, we blended the landscapes so that you can start walking on the structure, and it went and eventually merged with the ground. So your structure was nothing but just an extension of the ground plane. Then this was the big courtyard option, where we had a central big courtyard where we were planting our microforest, and all the programs were lined, along the courtyard. So what it really did was, when you're in this space, you have dense plantation on both sides. So at all times you feel like you're in a forest. And only the public programs, which is my common programs, tilted into these like almost like these glass um, pavilions in these in the central forest.
So I think, what
And
Sakshi is
this,
also kind of trying to show within the, we just keep going, Sakshi, that's fine. Is to show just the iterative possibilities, not from the perspective to explain how much work we are doing really on a project, which is quite a bit, but it's also to talk about how this method of making is also a means for us to think through what works for a project and what doesn't. The way that we actually work in the studio, we're very kind of, let's say, apprehensive about people who know exactly what they want. I mean, because we never come from that position. We, in fact, the idea of working on projects is to really find out more about what a project is, or what a particular orientation towards what our ambitions for a project are. If you know what the project is going to be at the beginning of a project, then the process really has no meaning, because you could just make a sketch and have somebody draw that out and convert that into a building. And we are at a point where technology allows us to do that, right? But it's really about the process that Sakshi is kind of showing you, is really about finding out what a project needs to be, what it must become in response to its environment, in response to the client and its program. And if you're able to, in some sense, detach, let's say, the ego of the architect, which there is no reason to actually be there, because we never actually make a building ourselves. We're always working with other people, and it's a collaborative process, even in its most kind of isolated form. If you're able to separate the ego from the project, you will end up getting a much richer project because of it. And so I think that is also one of the reasons why, while I kind of say it with almost kind of this hindsight, the benefit of hindsight, the move from the compositional to, for the lack of a better word, the logical is something that was prompted by this move away from being prescriptive to being, let's say, designing with context rather than designing with control. So next, Sakshi, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Just another image of the model. So what I'm going to really take you through is some of our Rhino models. So this is the kind of process that we follow when. So after the meeting, the client picked the street form, and then we started explorations on that one plan type. And it ranged from, these rectangular pavilions, which, almost completely disappeared in the trees, to, your landscape just flowing, and, these mounds, and your structure just almost disappearing and being one with, the surroundings. Then, so this is the same option where, the entire program is beneath these mounds. We have this one clear story which runs across the entire structure, which, also provides light and cross ventilation. Every program opened into these kind of balconies, in addition to the central courtyard, of course, ensuring that we have cross ventilation everywhere. The slopes were such that, you could almost just climb up the structure, so you never really knew that. So the structure is just an extension of the ground in some sense. Just another angle.
But you see also what Sakshi actually is kind of describing here. Just go back, Sakshi. Is ways of looking at junctions, of ways of looking at openings, because how do you actually do openings otherwise, right? I mean, is there, what do you see here, that little split between that? So what you're trying to do is trying to reason that out, both in terms of structure, but also in terms of integration with this nature of tectonics that we were exploring here. Next. Sorry, go ahead, Sakshi. So there were
So the
various
next
versions,
option is
not all of them good. So
yeah.
you have to go through
So
the
this is
bad
another
as well.
option.
Don't, I mean, like while Sakshi is
Yeah.
being so sure about everything, I don't know whether all of the spaces were actually well ventilated and all of the options that we did. Huh? So it's things that, you know, some things work, some things don't work, but unless you try it, you will not know, right? And when something is bad, you should be kind of critical enough to say that it's bad. Like, this is horrible. So go next.
Yeah. So this is again the mounds broken into a smaller scale, where each program was a mound by itself.
Don't describe it, Sakshi. Don't give it that much importance. Just go next. There's not that much. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this was where the central spaces were mounds, and the other spaces were just these rectangles that were plugged in. The central street. So what we really, after all that exploration, what we really did finally go ahead was, you know, this option where we had these pavilions. This entire, all the space between the pavilions is going to be, you know, dense foliage. Just a couple of visuals of the final option that really went through the living space. Yeah. So the next project that we're really going to run through is something that we're currently working on. So there are two plots.
Also,
it's
sorry, just let me, can I just
like,
add, Sakshi has, I don't know why, but Sakshi has not shown you all images of all of the models, physical models that we had done for the last project. There were lots of them and they were really nice. But for some reason, Sakshi has chosen not to reveal the entire gamut of our expertise. So she's keeping it a secret, but it's there.
I thought they'll get bored if it's just too long.
No. Hey, also, guys, feel free to ask questions in between. Huh? You don't have to wait for us to finish and then, you know, ask questions. Half the things that we've said, you'll forget, and half the things that we've said, we'll also forget. So, yeah.
Yeah. So this is a huge project. We have two plots. One is a 9-acre plot and one is a 7-acre plot. Both of them are very different. One has a lot of trees, almost like 150 trees, and the other one is completely barren. Plot one is almost flat, while the other one has a considerable contour. So the plot one, which was the township project, which was almost 9 acres. Yeah. So when we really got a brief from the client,
it's a township for a steel plant. Huh? So it's basically where workers in a steel plant are going to live. So yeah, it's basically housing for those guys.
Yeah, so this is actually when we really started the project, we started analyzing the benefits of a low-rise building over a high-rise building, especially in the context that, you know, the site is, where there's absolutely nothing around it except a cement plant. So, you know, when you're actually in a high-rise, all you really see is barren land around, as opposed to, you know, when you're in a low-rise, you experience the trees. It's almost like living, you know, within the folly. A low-rise structure also gives you more surface area. So, you know, Orissa is really, really hot in summer. So the potential of generating solar energy here is a lot, which, you know, will not be really capitalized if we went with a high-rise. The same goes with water harvesting. They have a lot of rain. So more roof area also means more surface area to collect more water. So from all the studies that, you know, we had, and a lot of data that we really found, it really felt like low-rise buildings were more, you know, we'd actually say like the 10 times the like cheaper than you know, high-rise buildings.
Also, just to kind of add to this, this is of course data that Professor Ashok Lal very kindly shared, stuff that he had actually worked on and based on his research. So, you know, the other thing is to think about architecture not as, I know we are taught as architecture students that architecture and architects are people who kind of practice by themselves, who are these people who are creative geniuses, who wake up in the morning, have a fantastic idea, and you know, it gets built the next day. But there is very little that actually happens with that. If you ask all of the masters, Korea, you know, in his time, the Doshi, you know, all of them will talk about how if you kind of probe them just the right amount, they'll tell you how hard they've had to actually work to get to a project. And what we are actually doing today is maybe, I think what's important is for us to also be able to build on the shoulders of these giants, of all of these people who've already done so much work and are so kind to actually share their experience and their information with us. If we don't, create environments that are more sensitive than what we are kind of taught to do in colleges, I think it'll be a great disservice. So, like I said earlier, this is thanks to all of the wonderful data that Professor Ashok Lal had given us. Next.
So what we also did was, because Orissa has a lot of rainfall, we used CFD to actually analyze the direction, the angle, the intensity with which you'd get rainfall on our site, and the kind of overhangs that we would require to really protect our buildings from the rains. So before we started working on it, what we first did was identify the buildable area, because there were a lot of trees on this plot. And we had a couple of approaches. One was, the street format, where we broke the entire program, and as per zoning, we distributed it across the site, and then we created these, communal streets, which I mean, I'll just take you through the plan. So between the structures, we had these narrow streets which were activated through these projections, and we were scooping out. We had balconies projecting out. We had these other balconies that were carved into the building to activate the central street. And this was one of the modules that we generated for this plan type, where you can see these balconies, visual of the, yeah. So this is the kind of space that we were really looking to create. And another option that we really tried was periphery, where we broke the the entire program down. We pushed it right at the edge of the buildable area, and we created this huge, massive central space. So you can see this in the plan, where we had this one huge connecting space in the middle. And what we then did was, even this, the program, the built mass, we staggered it so that we could continue the ground plane up. So, even the upper floors really felt like, they could just step out into this street. What we also did with the plans really was that we followed this vertical grid, like this very vertical grid, which ensured that every program had cross ventilation. So when you look at it's a very basic massing that we had, where the upper terraces was like an extension of the ground plane. So this was the kind of space that we were really trying to create, where a lot of times the ground floor, like whoever's living on the ground floor, has the luxury of just stepping out and accessing the common space, and we were doing the same with the upper floors as well. Then the third option was almost like a hybrid option, where we broke it down into these thin, narrow fingers, and we pushed them along the periphery, creating these narrow streets between these modules, and also creating a central peripheral area. So yeah, this is the plan that goes with it. And what we then did was we also started stepping the modules back. So, the central area looked even bigger. And again, with every plan that, we were working with, we made sure that, all our common spaces had cross ventilation. So we were very particular about the vertical grids and ensuring that, you get that kind of cross ventilation in these houses. One of the modules that we were really working with here.
Sakshi, where are these models? Where are the models?
This one's in the basement, Sameer.
Okay, while you kind of explain it, I'm going to go take a trip down and show them the models as well. Okay. So they get a tour of a live feed tour. Yeah. So you can go ahead. You can keep talking, Sakshi. I'll just run them.
Sure. Okay, yeah. So this was the kind of space that we were really trying to create, where people can just, a very active community space. So after the client input, they were really intent on doing the peripheral option for the master plan, because they wanted a central open space. And when it came to the module, they were very intent on combining the street module and the stepped terrace module. So what we really ended up with was a master plan where, naturally, because of the tapering site, we had a street happening here, whereas the right side was completely open, and the structures are pushed to the periphery with a central open space. All our common areas, common programs, sorry, were in the center, which was accessible for everyone. This is the master plan. Yeah, and this is the visual that goes with it, where you see that these are our 2 BHK modules. You have a central community space, and you have these terraces that step back. Another visual of the same. This is the central area where we have the temple, like the common programs, which is the temple, the clubhouse, the dining pavilion, and a central open space for people to perform and, just spill out into. And this is the narrow part of the site where naturally we have, this communal street that is being created in the middle here. And you have these terraces that step back. A physical model for the same. I think you can see me pointing at it. And yeah, the physical model. Yeah. So one of the very real aspects of every project that you really don't have to deal with in college is costing analysis. But just to put things into perspective, both the plots, we took a month and a half to design almost 2 lakh square feet, and it took us 2 months to resolve and to value engineer and to really fit, work out the costing of just 2,000 square feet, which is just a very, very small part of the entire structure. So that just puts things into perspective as to how important this really is. And so the first thing that we did was, so the client gave us a fixed budget. We started analyzing, local rates, local labor rates, material rates, and just in general the kind of costing for one typical structure, and we divided that with the total budget that the client had, and we generated these areas. Then we started working backwards with the plan to really understand how much we really need to cut back, and we managed to cut back by 35%, but that was still not enough. And even currently where this project is in the tendering stage. So we've managed to get the costing down from 3,400 to 2,500 to 1,890, 1,600. It's like a very slow process of how you can value engineer without really affecting the architectural intent. So in the end, your project is still going to have the same integrity, but you're working with these smaller specifications to cut back the costs. So that's the stage at which this project really is right now. And yeah, so plot 2 is the housing plot. It's a very linear plot, with a lot of contours, and naturally because of the shape of the site, we could really just stack all our programs horizontally. If you look at it, the programs are it's a very different mix of programs here. This is the miniature. So Sami, whatever he's showing you is a work in progress of the miniature that we're generating for this project. So you have the workers dormitory, you have a hospital and training center, which is a part of CRS. Then you have security barracks, which is nothing but dormitories for security people. And then you have a truck parking and accommodation for the truck drivers. This is a master plan of the same, where we've divided the site into different sections based on the use of each program. Yeah, so because of the contours, what we really did was we started getting a truck parking on a higher level, and naturally because of the contours, the space that we got below is what we used for the driver's dormitory. And so if you look at a regular parking structure, you'll see that it's always horizontally aligned, and then you have this apron where you have it's a required space, for the turning of the truck, which is humongous. And you actually look at it, and the amount of space that is really wasted is a lot. So what we then started doing was we started tilting them in a way that, we started combining the apron for every alternate truck parking spot, and we could actually reduce the slab by 23%. So the amount of RCC that we're using here is 23% lesser than, you would for a regular truck parking. So that was one way that, we used to cut down on not just the cost, but also, be a little more conscious about how much we're building. And then we started creating these gaps in between so that each of these truck, dormitories have cross ventilation as well. So then moving on to the workers' dormitory. So if you look at a regular rectangular plan, you'll notice that, people have absolutely zero privacy. If you start building walls in between, you cut off cross ventilation. So what we really started doing was, getting more edges, getting more, surfaces to really have windows to enable cross ventilation. So even if you put a barrier in between, we'll still really have cross ventilation in the entire structure. So this was just one module. We took this one octagonal module and we built, with it. So we had one service block in the middle with 3 residential blocks plugging into it. And we arranged it in a way that we naturally got these, courtyards. Here, you'll see these courtyards, you'll see these common toilet and service blocks with these residential blocks plugging into it and directly accessing the service areas. This is the built form. So the roof sloped with these gutters so that, we could direct the rainwater in the middle and, really have a catchment area over there. And if you actually look at the section, again, the reason why we have these courtyards and these clear stories is so that, we have enough cross ventilation so that the cool air enters and the hot air, just exits from these clear stories. This is an image of the physical model, but I think it's blurred out a little. Again, an image of the physical model that Sami was just showing you. Hospital and training center. So we followed a similar logic for the hospital and training center as well, where we put all the service blocks, all the common blocks, all the toilets and everything in the center, and all the other programs are plugged into it. So this was again the built mass with these courtyards in between. And, we had these north lights which open here to the north for, sufficient light. So if you look at it again, the clear story and the courtyards enable cross ventilation, and it ensures that the place is always ventilated, even, during summers. Again, a physical model of the same. This is a visual that shows you the security barracks and the truck parking area. Another long visual of the site. So this is the central courtyard that is formed in the dormitories, which is like this common space for them. Yeah, I think that's about it. So yeah, Sami, do you want to take over?
Yeah, no, actually, I think Sakshi, I'm sorry, I must have upset your rhythm by walking around the studio showing those models, but no, I think
No.
You pretty much covered everything that I wanted to say as well, and I think this is just a kind of quote that I really kind of like, and it's a essay by A.K. Ramanujan, which talks about how India, or the context that we work in, is so varied that to think about it as a singular method of that through a singular method of operation you can actually define or capture that essence of what it truly means to be Indian is completely flawed. I mean, he talks about the fact that its diversity probably is the one most significant part of the Indian way in some sense, and it's in today's times that that this idea of what is Indianness probably needs definition more than anything else. And I think this essay is actually a kind of great way to think about it. I would strongly suggest if if people on this kind of conversation have not seen this before or read this before, you should totally do that. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all that we've had to say. And yeah, apologies for all the kind of informality in the way that we were presenting, but it was we're just trying to see if we can do something more with the medium that is otherwise becoming this kind of two-dimensional interaction, which is very let's say monotonous in many ways. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So if there are any questions, feel free to ask. Sakshi, you can stop sharing.
Yeah.
Yes, and thank you, sir and ma'am. That was very informative and an intriguing presentation. So as students, actually, it really gives us a wider perspective on the design approach and the realistic process with few minor details of such large-scale projects. Additionally, also thank you, Sanitsa, for that impromptu studio tour. We really loved it. We are now open to questions from our audience, and people joining us from the Facebook Live stream can just post their questions there, and we will pick it up for you. I request everyone asking questions to also keep their cameras on.
So can we say that architects are, shaping the minds of people or changing the choices in a way? Like, what are your views upon it?
So I feel architecture actually has the potential to be able to impact people who use a particular space, right? I mean, so very simple things. If you position your bed in a particular way and you have a window next to it, you'll get sunlight coming into your house, into your room, on your bed, on your face at 6 a.m. in the morning. It kind of starts programming your day in a particular way. So you start developing a kind of attitude. Are you developing a way of living depending on the kind of architecture that you inhabit? So for sure, architecture has a let's say a kind of role to play in that, in fashioning the way that lifestyles are. But also architecture for sure has a socio-political connotation as well. I mean, the use of architecture as a tool to further kind of political standpoint is not new. It's been done since centuries, right? And so there is the idea of architecture being used as a tool to do that. But I feel that parametric, what you can refer to as parametric architecture, really, if you simplify those terms, is about working with a series of parameters that are informed by recursive process. Now, that could be a resultant of you do manually or through a script on Grasshopper or Rhino. So these tools are merely just that. They're tools. The intent and the process is what these tools plug into. So I think what is important is to be able to define what you want to achieve, not in terms of the form of a project, which parametric architecture tends to exemplify, but to really think about what is the value that you're able to create through this act of building. When you use resources that are in any case scarce and you're creating a project with that, are you being able to better the environment? Are you being able to better the lives of the people who wouldn't have had access to that betterment had that building not been created? So those are the questions that you need to answer, whether it's parametric tools or it's physical models. That for me is not the point. I think what you really allude to is this idea of a recursive process, and if that recursive process can be achieved through analog tools, that's fine as well.
Like if we want to introduce green elements in our structure or in a mass housing project, then what is the certainty that it will stand out or get along with the surrounding space?
So I think this idea of green architecture or sustainability is something that no longer can be seen as a specialized facet to a project, or a project can be sustainable, or it can be parametric, or it can be modern, or what have you. It's basically I think you have no choice but to think about the sustainability of what you build. So whether it is through the way that you imagine the materials that go into the building, or the way that you actually treat planting, or landscape, the way that you kind of work with existing landscape on your project. I think the time where we had to able to build, if there ever was such a time, we build without being cognizant of the natural forces operating on your site is gone. I think you have no choice but to be sustainable in every project you do. So I don't think you need to think. I don't think you need to consider whether you should be sustainable or not, or you should try to build by green. I'm assuming you mean sustainable. Whether you should or be sustainable or not is no longer an option. You have to be. So that's a given. So when you explain a project today, I'm going to assume automatically that sustainability is already built into the project, and then let's see what else you can do. Yeah. So I think Sakshi, do you want to kind of add anything to that?
No, Samik, I think you covered it all.
Us how different what you've learned, or maybe not different. I'm not sure. That's something that you can clarify. Your education has been in college, and what you've been doing in practice.
So one thing about working here especially is how we don't really function as an office. It's more of an extension of a college studio. So in some way, the way we approach design, of course, there's a little more clarity, but we still go through a lot of iterative process. Like there's no hierarchy in that way. We're all there with the artboard, everyone's giving their opinion. We're all discussing design together. So I think it's very similar to how college was, where you'd go to a professor and you'll sit in a group and you'll just discuss your design and what you're doing with the space. It's very similar in that way. So I think, of course, there's been a lot of funding, but for me, it has been an extension of college.
So how do you think we should approach cities all over India to handle like such a huge influx?
I think when you talk about housing, and I'm assuming you're talking about housing, we have to kind of think about the fact that housing is tied into livelihood. No one's going to want to livelihood and the freedom of choice, right? And no one's going to want to move from their villages to a slum and live there, given the paucity of resources. But again, slums in a city in India are probably the only affordable housing that migrants can actually afford to live in. And what we have to figure is is there an institutional way to deal with that, to be able to anticipate the nature of housing that we need to create for people who come to seek livelihoods, and whose generations then move through this kind of cycle of improving their livelihood potential, and then moving up to better accommodation, so on and so forth. Is there a way for us to imagine that what we think about as a bottleneck, as a slum, as being informal, is not maybe the problem? It is actually a solution. And as all processes exist, there are bottlenecks in that solution, not enough light, not enough ventilation, so on and so forth. But it is for us as architects to look at what the city in some sense creates, and to see if we can actually use that to structure a model of affordable housing within our cities. And just to give you an example of let's say the way that the state or the city actually ends up thinking about housing, not as housing as a place to live in, but really as real estate. They think about for instance, the BST. I don't know if you've read this. The BST bus terminuses throughout the city they're now being examined. They've already kind of done that in a few projects. They are now being examined for their real estate potential, because I read a kind of headline in the paper which said something to the effect that BEST sits on a gold mine of resources, land resource in the city, but which is ridiculous, because the first thing that you would think about is that if the state owns land in the city, that you would think about how that land can better the life of its citizens, whether it is migrants, whether it is for affordable housing, or for open space or green space. But what you actually get here is state trying to sell off a part of that land to private developers as generate funds to better the balance sheet of the BEST, which is in some sense really staggering, that the state itself starts thinking like a real estate developer. While this is like, it kind of points to a political, a socio-political kind of conditioning, institutional conditioning. I think what we need to explore as architects with the tools that we have is to think if there are ways for us to mobilize a set of methods by which we can start looking at the kind of housing, the variety of housing that you get in a slum, where the house is also a place for production, where it is a place for small industry, where a room can be both a place where they make chatais in the day, but also becomes a dormitory at night, where this multiple use of space is something that is encoded within in the way that we imagine affordable housing or housing in small spaces. The new research, the new book that we are working on, builds on some of these issues and kind of tries to suggest possible ways that we can actually look at it through regulatory frameworks, through building code. That's really the approach that we have to take to think about what we see as problems in our cities like slums, but to really see them not as problems but as solutions, and to figure out how to make those solutions better. So yeah. Does that answer your question? Sorry.
So what exactly is your approach towards combining the aspect of aesthetics, the structural integrity, and even the philosophy, like all in one design?
So, just to be it's a very good question, actually. But I have to say that aesthetic is something that we are not inherently interested in. The aesthetic has to be a subset of a spatial experience. It has to be a subset of a certain performance that we expect from a building, of how, let's say, if a building looks a particular way because of the fact that we use thicker walls, and because of the fact that it creates warmth during the cold months and heat during the winter months, or because of the fact that the form of the building allows us to do an entire kind of shell structure in brick tile without using RCC. That form for us is beautiful. I mean, form, beautiful for us is as beautiful does. I mean, it is not about how it looks, that cliche about it's not about how it looks, it's about how it works. I mean, I think that's really for us a kind of touchstone in our project. So many times when we are kind of working on projects, we are constantly moving back and forth. We kind of we get to a point where we've almost finalized a project with our clients, but we find that we've missed that essence of the building being what it is inherently or logically meant to be, and then we kind of backtrack and we come back. So it's yeah, for us, what is most important is that the building should be a kind of subset of the visual of the building has to be a subset of the way that it works, not the other way around. I mean, we can keep doing interesting form with building, but again, we can kind of do kind of wavy walls with RCC. You can with shell concrete. You can do pretty much any kind of form that you want to do. But the fact that you have that much choice should also make you more particular about the way that you exercise that choice. Huh? So, given the fact that we live in an age where there is so much information so easily accessible to us, it is not about us being able to imbibe that information. It is us being able to sieve out what is of value from all of the multiple kind of inputs that you receive when you're actually kind of trying to inform yourself. So I think that this ability of value and discretion are two things that should operate on any project.
While going through the design for Temple of Steps, we noticed the use of ghats to refill the water. How did you come across the idea of incorporating it? And
yeah, no, I think it's really about the relationship of water and land, and it's also, if most of you probably kind of seen a temple precinct, an older temple precinct, you will see that most of these old temple precincts, whether in north or in south, more so in the south actually, used to have the kund as a part of the temple form, right? Because it was a water reservoir. It was a place that people would come to, where they would kind of bathe and stuff like that. So it was really a kind of community resource. And this idea of the ghat, while it's kind of architectural idea, in some sense, it's a tectonic idea, but the basis of that are very elemental. The fact that there was a need to kind of store water, which is why you actually kind of create a low-lying area. And the way to access that water is through the steps for lots of people to access it, right? So so that really is the way that kind of formulation happened. It's just to kind of understand the nature of how do you connect land and water. And if you look at the architecture of temples, especially of the South Indian temples, you'll see that there is this distinct kind of horizontal nature of layering, right? So in some sense, that step also becomes a means for us to codify a basic building module that will create both the step as well as the form of the extrusion, the temple form. So it was in trying to reduce the number of influences that you would bring into a project to a basic module from which you can do many things. Again, the idea of doing more with less, in some sense, was where that comes from.
How much time do you really take in the conceptual stage of the design, and how hard do you really try to retain that concept, even if that concept sometimes don't work out like initially?
That's a very good question. Yeah, very good question. And it takes a lot of time. Sometimes we kind of hold on to that idea from the beginning to the end. Sometimes that idea evolves. Sometimes it turns into something that's completely different. I think the idea of the concept of for a project need not show up right at the beginning of the project. It's something that also might evolve as you kind of go through the life cycle of finding what the project needs to be. So we personally don't kind of believe that the concept of a project needs to be explicit the minute you start. It's something that you find out as you go through, these various stages of making models, drawings, 3Ds, going back and forth. Yeah. So to find, I think, the essence or the conceptual basis of a project. But sometimes it happens at the beginning as well. So it works both ways. Yeah. The only thing is that when you kind of think that all projects need to have a point, a static point which you have already understood, then it becomes, like I said, it's contingent on your own abilities, right? And it's not open to other influences, other people's thoughts, other material investigations. If every time it has to be, if you are the only reference for the projects will eventually be limited by your own abilities and will not be informed by the multiple influences that any project or any site has in our country. So.
I guess we don't have any more questions, so we can end today's Mananya.
Great.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
We hope once college begins offline, we can again invite you both. We would get a chance to meet you as well as visit some of your projects in the city.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Good luck to everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much
for joining us today.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.